You may not believe that poverty can push a man toward choices that make his heart pound with fear and tremble with hope at the same time. You may not believe that sometimes fate knocks on our door in ways no one could ever predict. But it is the truth. And this is the story of Mason Calloway. The alarm never woke him anymore. Mason's body had learned to rise before the sun, trained by something deeper than any clock could measure. Each morning at 4:15, his eyes would open to the sound of dry coughing from the small room next door. The cough was soft, almost apologetic, as if his daughter understood that her sickness was an inconvenience to the world. But to Mason, that cough was everything. It was the reason he breathed. It was the reason he existed. It was the sound that reminded him why he had to keep going when every fiber of his being screamed for him to give up. Ellie was 6 years old. She had crystal blue eyes that sparkled like morning dew on spring grass, and when she smiled, which was not often enough these days, the entire room seemed to brighten. She carried within her tiny chest a congenital heart condition that the doctors called complex and severe. The medical terminology meant nothing to Mason. All he understood was that his daughter's heart was broken in ways that only money could fix. $200,000. That was the price tag they had placed on her life. And Mason, he had nothing but a pair of calloused hands and a mountain of debt that pressed down on him like the sky itself was collapsing onto his shoulders. He walked into her room that morning, as he did every morning, careful to make his footsteps light so as not to disturb her fragile sleep. The walls were decorated with drawings she had made during her good days, colorful images of butterflies and rainbows, and a family standing in front of a house with a red door. In every drawing, there were three figures: a tall man with brown hair, a small girl with yellow pigtails, an empty space where someone else should have been. Ellie had stopped drawing her mother 8 months ago. Mason sat on the edge of her bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Each breath was a small victory. Each exhale was a promise that she would take another. The oxygen concentrator hummed softly in the corner, a constant mechanical heartbeat that supplemented her struggling one. He reached out and brushed a strand of blonde hair from her forehead, and she stirred her eyes, fluttering open to find his face. "Daddy." Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from the coughing that plagued her nights. "Hey, princess, how are you feeling?" She considered the question with a seriousness that no 6-year-old should possess. "My chest feels heavy, like there's an elephant sitting on it." "An elephant, huh? Must be a pretty small elephant." A ghost of a smile crossed her pale lips. "Maybe a baby elephant." "Daddy, are elephants real? I've only seen them in books." "They're real, sweetheart. One day I'll take you to see them. We'll go to the zoo and you can feed them peanuts and they'll wave their big trunks at you." Promise. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the promises Mason had already broken. He promised her mother would stay. He promised they would keep the house with the backyard swing. He promised everything would be okay. And one by one, those promises had crumbled like sandcastles against the tide. "I promise, baby girl. Now try to rest. Grandma will be here soon." He kissed her forehead and stood, his knees aching from kneeling on the thin carpet. At 34 years old, Mason Calloway felt ancient. His body bore the marks of a life spent in physical labor, and his soul carried wounds that no medicine could heal. As he moved toward the door, Ellie's small voice stopped him. "Daddy, will you come back?" The question pierced him more deeply than she could ever know. "I always come back, Ellie, always." He stepped into the hallway and closed her door gently behind him. The apartment was small, cramped, a 2-bedroom unit on the east side of Austin, where the rent was cheap because the neighborhood was not. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the arguments from the couple next door, the crying baby 2 floors up, the constant bass from the bar at the corner that never seemed to close. But it was all he could afford. After selling the house, after paying off what he could of the medical bills, after Dana took her half and disappeared into another life, this was what remained. Mason made his way to the kitchen, which was really just a corner of the living room, with a stove and a refrigerator that groaned like an old man every time it cycled. He put water on to boil and stared out the window at the gray Austin sky. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, but the beauty was lost on him. All he could see was the stack of bills on the counter. All he could feel was the weight of time running out. His life had not always been this bleak. 3 years ago, Mason had been a different man living a different life. He had a small house in suburban Austin with a backyard where Ellie used to play. He had a steady job at Henderson's Auto Repair, where his skill with engines had earned him respect and decent pay. And he had Dana, the woman he met at a coffee shop when he was 26, the woman who laughed at his terrible jokes and made him believe in things like forever and always, and until death do us part. They were happy once, or at least Mason believed they were happy. They struggled like any young couple, pinching pennies and dreaming of better days, but they had each other. And when Dana told him she was pregnant, when they held Ellie for the first time in that hospital room with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Mason thought he understood what life was supposed to be about. He thought he had figured out the secret that so many people spend their whole lives searching for. The first sign that something was wrong came when Ellie was 2. She would get tired more easily than other children, her lips sometimes turning a faint shade of blue during her naps. The pediatrician initially dismissed it as nothing serious, but Dana insisted on more tests. And then the diagnosis came delivered in a sterile office by a cardiologist who spoke in terms and percentages and probabilities, none of which meant anything except one undeniable fact. Their daughter's heart was failing. Complex congenital heart disease, the doctor explained. A combination of defects that would require surgical intervention. The operation itself was risky, but necessary. Without it, Ellie might not see her 10th birthday. And the cost was beyond anything they could imagine, $200,000. The number seemed abstract at first, like something from a news story about other people's problems. But as the insurance company's rejections piled up, as the appeals were denied, as the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore, that number transformed into a prison sentence. It was a wall that separated their daughter from life itself, and no matter how hard Mason worked, no matter how many overtime hours he logged at the shop, he could not climb it. Dana tried it first. She took a second job waiting tables at night, coming home exhausted with her feet aching and her smile growing thinner with each passing week. They sold the car and bought a cheaper one. They canceled the cable to gym membership, the small luxuries that had once made life feel livable. They applied for every assistance program they could find, sat in waiting rooms, filling out forms, explained their situation to bureaucrats who looked at them with the tired eyes of people who had heard 1,000 similar stories. Nothing was enough. The debt kept growing. The surgery date kept getting pushed back. And slowly something in Dana began to break. Mason remembered the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what it would come to represent. He came home from the shop to find Dana sitting at the kitchen table, her suitcase already packed and waiting by the door. Ellie was asleep in her room, unaware that her world was about to shatter. Dana looked at him, and her eyes were not angry or sad. They were empty, hollow, like someone who had already left long before her body decided to follow. "I can't do this anymore, Mason." He stood in the doorway, still wearing his oil-stained work clothes, trying to process words that did not make sense. "Can't do what? What are you talking about? This, all of this, the bills, the hospitals, the endless waiting for something that's never going to come. I can't do it anymore." "Dana, I know it's hard. I know you're tired, but we'll figure it out. We always do." She shook her head slowly, and the motion seemed to cost her everything she had left. "No, Mason, we won't. I've been lying to myself, lying to you, pretending that somehow things will get better. But they won't. They're only going to get worse. So what, you're just going to leave? What about Ellie?" The silence that followed his question lasted only seconds, but it stretched into eternity. When Dana finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Ellie is dying, Mason. No matter what we do, no matter how much money we find, she's dying. And I can't sit here and watch it happen. I'm not strong enough. She's not dying. The surgery can save her. The doctor said there's a good chance. A chance, a possibility, a maybe. That's all we have, Mason. Maybes, and I can't build a life on maybes anymore." She stood and walked toward the door, picking up her suitcase with hands that did not tremble. Mason wanted to stop her. He wanted to grab her arm and beg her to stay, to remind her of the vows they had made, to plead for their daughter's sake. But something in his chest had turned to stone, and he could not move. He could only watch as the woman he loved opened the door and stepped out into the night. "Where will you go?" Dana paused but did not turn around. "Michael has a place in Houston. I'll stay with him for a while." Michael, the name hit Mason like a physical blow. Michael Reynolds, Dana's colleague from the marketing firm where she used to work before the economy forced layoffs. Michael, who had always been a little too friendly, a little too attentive, a little too willing to offer a shoulder when Dana needed to cry. How long? Does it matter? How long, Dana? She finally turned, and for just a moment, Mason saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. 6 months since her third birthday party, the one you missed because you were working a double shift. Mason felt the world tilt beneath his feet. 6 months, half a year of lies, half a year of another man's hands on his wife while he worked himself to exhaustion, trying to save their daughter. The betrayal was so complete, so total, that it almost circled back around to something like relief. At least now he knew. At least now he understood why she had grown distant, why her kisses had become mechanical, why she flinched sometimes when he reached for her in bed. Get out. Mason, get out now. Before I say something I can't take back. She left without another word. The door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed through the empty apartment like a gunshot. Mason stood in the silence, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway, listening to the elevator doors open and close, listening to the last remnants of his marriage disappear into the Texas night. He did not cry. He needed to, but the tears would not come. Instead, he walked to Ellie's room and stood in the doorway watching his daughter sleep. She was so small, so fragile, curled up in her princess blanket, with her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. She had no idea that her mother had just abandoned her. She had no idea that the family she drew in her pictures would never exist again. Mason made a promise to himself that night, standing in that doorway with his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He would never leave. No matter how hard things got, no matter how dark the road became, he would never do to Ellie what Dana had done. He would stay. He would fight. And somehow, some way, he would save her. The next morning, he began the process of dismantling his life. He sold the house at a loss, using the money to pay down the most pressing debts. He sold the furniture, the television, Dana's jewelry that she had left behind. He sold everything except Ellie's toys and books, the essentials they needed to survive, and a single photograph of the three of them taken on a beach vacation before everything fell apart. He kept the photograph not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of what he had lost, a reminder of why he could never stop fighting. He found the apartment on the east side of Austin because it was cheap and because they allowed him to pay weekly instead of monthly. He enrolled Ellie in a home care program through the county hospital, which provided a visiting nurse and basic medical supplies. And he began searching for work, any work that would allow him to be with his daughter during the day while still earning enough to survive. That was when he found the job at Aldrich Holdings. The position was nothing special. Night janitor at the corporate headquarters, working from 11 in the evening until 7 in the morning. The pay was slightly above minimum wage, but they offered health insurance after 90 days, and the schedule meant Mason could be with Ellie during her waking hours. He applied without hope, expecting to be rejected, as he had been rejected by so many other companies who did not want to hire a man with a sick child and a mountain of personal problems. But Aldrich Holdings said yes. The HR representative, a tired-looking woman named Sandra, barely glanced at his resume before handing him a stack of forms to fill out. She did not ask about his previous experience. She did not ask why he wanted to work nights. She simply needed a body to push a mop and empty trash cans, and Mason was a body willing to do both. He started the following Monday. The headquarters of Aldrich Holdings was a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Austin, 47 floors of glass and steel that dominated the skyline like a monument to wealth and power. During the day, thousands of employees in expensive suits hurried through its lobbies and conference rooms, making decisions that moved millions of dollars with a single phone call. But at night, the building transformed into something else entirely. A tomb, a cathedral of silence, a place where a man like Mason could disappear into the shadows and pretend for a few hours at least that he was invisible. His duties were simple: clean the floors, empty the trash, wipe down the glass surfaces that seemed to cover every wall, stock the bathrooms with supplies, report any maintenance issues to the day shift supervisor, do not speak to anyone unless spoken to, do not access any restricted areas, do not ask questions. Mason followed the rules religiously. He arrived early, clocked in, collected his supplies, and began his rounds. He started on the ground floor and worked his way up, methodically moving from office to office, hallway to hallway, floor to floor. The work was tedious and repetitive, exactly the kind of mindless labor that allowed his body to function on autopilot while his mind drifted elsewhere. He thought about Ellie constantly. During his breaks, he would find a quiet corner and video call her on his old smartphone, watching her sleepy face appear on the cracked screen. His mother, Lorraine, had moved in to help care for Ellie during the night, sleeping on the pull-out couch in the living room and waking every few hours to check on her granddaughter. Lorraine was 72 years old and her hands had begun to shake from early-stage Parkinson's disease, but she insisted on helping. "Family takes care of family," she said. "That's how it's always been. That's how it will always be." Mason was grateful for his mother's presence, even as guilt gnawed at him for burdening her with his problems. She had already lost her husband, his father Harold, to lung cancer 5 years ago. She had already watched her son's marriage collapse. She had already sacrificed so much, and now he was asking her to sacrifice even more. But there was no other option. He could not afford professional caregivers. He could not leave Ellie alone. And so Lorraine came, bringing with her the same quiet strength that had carried her through 6 decades of hardship. Weeks passed. Months passed. Mason settled into a routine that was equal parts exhaustion and determination. He worked every night that shifts were available, picking up extra hours whenever he could. He applied for every assistance program, every charity, every foundation that offered help to families with sick children. Some provided small grants. Others offered to negotiate with the hospital on payment plans. A few simply sent form letters expressing their regret that they could not help at this time. The debt continued to grow. The surgery remained out of reach. And Ellie, his beautiful, brave daughter, grew slowly weaker. On good days, she would sit up in bed and color pictures or watch cartoons on the old tablet Mason had bought secondhand. She would ask questions about the world outside, about the zoo and the beach and the places she had seen only in books. She would laugh at his silly jokes and pretend to be asleep when he came to kiss her goodnight, only to giggle when he tickled her feet. On bad days, she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Her breathing would become labored, her skin pale and clammy, her eyes clouded with a fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. On those days, Mason would sit beside her bed and read stories aloud, his voice steady even as terror clawed at his insides. He would hold her small hand in his and tell her about all the adventures they would have when she got better, painting pictures with words of a future he desperately wanted to believe in. The worst moments came in the middle of the night when he was at work and his phone would buzz with a message from his mother. "Ellie is coughing again. Her lips are turning blue. Should I call the ambulance?" Each time Mason would feel his heart stop. Each time he would rush to find a quiet place to call home, praying that his daughter would answer in her small, tired voice. And each time the crisis would pass, leaving behind only the knowledge that the next one might not. 8 months into his job at Aldrich Holdings, Mason had become a ghost. He moved through the building unseen and unacknowledged, a shadow among shadows. The day shift employees barely knew he existed, and the few night security guards who crossed his path nodded in passing, but never stopped to chat. He was nobody. A janitor, a man with a mop and a bucket, and a lifetime of regret. But there was one person who noticed him. Every night when Mason reached the 47th floor, the top floor of the building, he would see a light still burning in the corner office. Through the glass walls, he could make out a figure at a massive desk surrounded by papers and screens, working at hours when the rest of the world was asleep. The nameplate on the door read Caroline Aldrich, CEO, but Mason did not need the nameplate to know who she was. Everyone in Texas knew Caroline Aldrich. She was the sole heir to the Aldrich fortune, the daughter of William Aldrich, who had built the company from nothing into one of the largest financial corporations in the state. When William suffered a stroke 15 years ago, Carolyn had stepped in to run the empire at the age of 26. She had not only preserved her father's legacy, but expanded it, acquiring competitors, entering new markets, and turning Aldrich Holdings into a powerhouse that influenced everything from real estate to energy to technology. The rumors about her were endless. They said she could buy an entire town without blinking. They said she had fired an executive simply because he dared to look her in the eye. They said she had never smiled in front of any employee, never attended a company party, never shown an ounce of warmth or humanity. She was a machine, the rumors claimed, a beautiful, brilliant, terrifying machine that existed only to accumulate power and wealth. Mason had never spoken to her. He had never even been within 10 feet of her. When he cleaned the 47th floor, he was careful to avoid her office entirely, working quickly and quietly in the surrounding areas before moving on. For a man like him, Carolyn Aldrich belonged to another world, a world of private jets and lavish galas and decisions that could change the fate of thousands. A world as distant from his cramped apartment and sick daughter as the stars were from the earth. He watched her sometimes, though. When he passed by the glass walls of her office, he would steal glances at the woman who controlled so much. She was always working, always focused her attention, fixed on documents or screens or phone calls that seemed to stretch for hours. She was beautiful in a cold, untouchable way, with blonde hair that she kept pulled back in a tight bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. She never looked up. She never noticed him. And Mason told himself that was exactly how it should be. But everything changed one night in October. The day had started badly and gotten worse. Ellie had woken up struggling to breathe, her small chest heaving with the effort of pulling air into her damaged lungs. Lorraine called an ambulance, and Mason rushed home from his morning grocery run to find paramedics in his living room, strapping his daughter to a stretcher while she cried and reached for him. The emergency room visit lasted 6 hours. The doctors ran tests, adjusted her medications, and ultimately sent her home with instructions to rest and monitor her closely. It was not the first time this had happened, and Mason knew it would not be the last. But each episode left him more drained than the one before, the accumulated stress wearing him down like water eroding stone. By the time he arrived at Aldrich Holdings that evening, Mason was running on fumes. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed his cart through the lobby. His mind kept drifting back to Ellie, to the image of her tiny body on that stretcher, to the fear in her eyes when the oxygen mask covered her face. He worked mechanically, moving through the floors without really seeing them. The 46th floor was nearly empty, as it always was at this hour, and Mason was wiping down the stairs when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was the hospital. The nurse's voice on the other end made his heart stop. "Mr. Calloway, this is Sarah from St. David's Cardiology Unit. I'm calling about Eleanor." Mason gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Is she okay? What happened?" "She's stable for now, sir, but Dr. Morrison wanted me to inform you that her condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The surgery needs to happen soon, within the next week if possible." "A week?" Mason's voice cracked. I can't. I understand this is difficult, Mr. Calloway. But without the surgery, Eleanor's heart will not be able to sustain her much longer. Dr. Morrison needs your answer by Friday. We need to know if you can arrange for the procedure." The call ended, but Mason did not move. He stood on the stairs of the 46th floor, staring at nothing, feeling the walls close in around him. A week, 7 days, 168 hours to find $200,000. His bank account held less than 300. His credit was destroyed. He had no assets left to sell, no family members to borrow from, no options left to explore. He collapsed onto the steps, his legs giving out beneath him. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered on the marble floor. For the first time in years, Mason Calloway allowed himself to cry. Not the quiet tears he sometimes shed in the shower when no one was watching, but great heaving sobs that racked his entire body. He cried for Ellie, who deserved so much better than the hand life had dealt her. He cried for himself, for his failures, for his inability to save the person who mattered most. He cried for every broken promise and every shattered dream and every moment of hope that had turned to ash in his hands. He did not know how long he sat there. Minutes, maybe. Hours. Time lost all meaning in the face of such complete despair. The building was silent around him, the only sound his own ragged breathing echoing off the marble walls. Then a voice cut through the darkness. Cold, sharp, commanding. "What are you doing here?" Mason's head snapped up. Standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the light from the 47th floor, was Caroline Aldrich. She looked exactly as she did every night through the glass walls of her office. A perfect black suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Blonde hair pulled back in that severe bun. Blue eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. But there was something different in the way she was looking at him now. Not anger, not disgust, something closer to curiosity. Mason scrambled to his feet, hastily wiping the tears from his face. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with explanations and excuses that all seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll get back to work right away. It won't happen again." He bent down to grab his phone from the floor, avoiding her gaze like a child caught doing something forbidden. Every instinct screamed at him to run to escape this encounter before it cost him his job. He could not afford to be fired. He could not afford another failure. But Caroline did not leave. She stood at the top of the stairs, watching him with those unreadable eyes, making no move to return to her office. "You work the night shift?" It was not a question. Mason nodded anyway. "Yes, ma'am. Mason Calloway. I've been here 8 months." She descended the stairs slowly, her heels clicking against the marble with each step. The sound was deliberate, measured like everything else about her. When she reached the landing where he stood, she stopped close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something expensive and floral, entirely out of place in the antiseptic silence of the stairwell. "You were crying." Mason felt his face flush with shame. "I received some difficult news, ma'am. Personal matter. It won't affect my work." "What news?" The question caught him off guard. In 8 months at Aldrich Holdings, no one had ever asked Mason a personal question. No one had ever shown the slightest interest in his life outside these walls. And yet, here was the CEO herself, the most powerful woman in Texas, standing in a stairwell at midnight, asking about his problems. He should have deflected. He should have given some vague answer and excused himself to continue cleaning. That was the safe option. That was what any sensible employee would do. But Mason was tired. Tired of carrying everything alone. Tired of pretending he was fine when he was falling apart. And something in Caroline's gaze, something beneath the ice, made him answer honestly. "My daughter is sick, ma'am. Heart condition. She needs surgery, and I can't afford it. The hospital called tonight to say she doesn't have much time left." The words hung in the air between them. Mason waited for Caroline to nod politely and walk away to dismiss his problems as none of her concern, to return to her world of billions and leave him to his mop and bucket. Instead, she said nothing. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, as if she were solving a complex equation in her head. "How much does the surgery cost?" $200,000, ma'am. Insurance won't cover it." "And how old is your daughter?" 6. Her name is Eleanor. Something flickered in Caroline's eyes at the name, but it was gone before Mason could identify it. She continued to study him, her gaze moving over his face like she was cataloging every detail for future reference. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, my office." Mason blinked. "Ma'am?" "Do not make me repeat myself, Mr. Calloway. 7 o'clock. Do not be late." She turned and walked back up the stairs, her heels echoing through the empty space until she disappeared through the door to the 47th floor. Mason stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had he just been fired? Promoted something else entirely? The encounter made no sense. Caroline Aldrich did not speak to janitors. She did not ask about their daughters or invite them to her office. She existed in a different universe, separated from people like Mason by barriers of wealth and status that were never meant to be crossed. And yet she had looked at him, really looked at him. Not through him, not past him, but directly into his eyes with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Mason finished his shift in a daze. He went through the motions of cleaning, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation over and over. By the time he clocked out and headed home, the sun was beginning to rise over Austin, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that he was too distracted to appreciate. He found his mother asleep on the couch, the television murmuring softly in the background. Ellie was still resting, her door closed, the hum of her oxygen concentrator audible through the thin walls. Mason checked on her, briefly confirming that she was breathing steadily, that her color was okay, that no new crisis had emerged during the night. Then he sat in his bedroom and stared at the ceiling, waiting for morning. At 6:30, he showered and dressed in the nicest clothes he owned. A white button-down shirt that had started to fade from too many washes, a pair of dark pants that he normally reserved for job interviews, shoes that he had polished the night before trying to remove scuffs that refused to disappear. He looked at himself in the cracked bathroom mirror and saw a tired man staring back, bags under his eyes, lines on his face that had not been there a few years ago, a body that was beginning to show the wear of too much stress and too little care. Not exactly the image of someone ready to meet with a billionaire CEO, but he had no choice. He had nothing to lose. At 6:45, Mason kissed his daughter goodbye and told his mother he had an appointment. Lorraine looked at him with curious eyes but did not ask questions. She had learned long ago that her son would share when he was ready, and pushing would only make him retreat further into himself. The bus ride downtown took 20 minutes. Mason sat in the back watching the city wake up around him, wondering what awaited him on the 47th floor of Aldrich Holdings. The optimistic part of his brain suggested that maybe, just maybe, Caroline Aldrich wanted to help. Maybe she had been moved by his story and wanted to offer some kind of assistance. Rich people did that sometimes, didn't they? Philanthropy, charity? But the realistic part of his brain, the part that had been battered by years of disappointment, told him to expect nothing. Best case scenario, she wanted to discuss some work-related matter that had nothing to do with Ellie. Worst case scenario, she was going to fire him for crying in the stairwell and lecture him about professionalism. He arrived at the building at 6:55. The lobby was beginning to fill with early arriving employees, men and women in expensive clothes, carrying expensive coffee and expensive briefcases. They glanced at Mason as he walked toward the elevator, their eyes sliding past him with practiced indifference. He was invisible to them. A janitor. A nobody. The elevator ride to the 47th floor seemed to take forever. Mason's heart pounded in his chest as the numbers climbed higher and higher. By the time the doors opened onto the executive level, his palms were sweating and his mouth had gone dry. The 47th floor was different during the day. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, illuminating the space in a warm golden glow that made everything look even more expensive than it had in the darkness. The furniture was all polished wood and soft leather. The art on the walls was clearly its original, not the reproductions that decorated the lower floors. The carpet beneath his feet was so thick it felt like walking on clouds. A secretary sat behind a sleek reception desk, typing something on a computer. She looked up as Mason approached, her expression neutral, but appraising. "Mr. Calloway, Mrs. Aldrich is expecting you. This way, please." She led him down a hallway lined with photographs of men in suits, shaking hands and signing documents. The history of Aldrich Holding, as Mason guessed. The founders and leaders and deal makers who had built this empire over generations. He did not recognize any of the faces except one. A portrait of a blond man with sharp features and cold eyes standing beside a young woman who could only be Caroline. William Aldrich and his daughter, taken some time before his stroke, had relegated him to the shadows. The secretary stopped in front of a set of frosted glass doors. "She's waiting for you inside. Good luck." Good luck. The words seemed ominous. Mason took a deep breath and pushed open the doors. Carolyn's office was enormous. It occupied the entire corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Austin skyline. The city spread out below like a map, other skyscrapers looking like miniature toys from this height. A massive black oak desk dominated one end of the room, covered with neat stacks of papers and a sleek computer monitor. Behind it sat Caroline Aldrich. She looked different in the daylight. Still beautiful, still cold, but there was something more human about her now. Maybe it was the way the sunlight softened the sharp lines of her face. Maybe it was the slight shadows under her eyes that suggested she had slept as little as Mason. Or maybe it was just his imagination, trying to find something familiar in this woman who controlled so much. "Sit." Mason walked toward the desk and lowered himself into the chair she had indicated. It was soft leather, absurdly comfortable, the kind of chair that belonged in a luxury home rather than an office. He sat on the edge, not allowing himself to relax. Carolyn studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes moving over his face with that same analytical intensity he had seen in the stairwell. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick leather briefcase, which she pushed across the desk toward him. "Open it." Mason's hands were trembling as he undid the clasp. Inside were papers. Dozens of papers neatly organized in folders and bound with clips. He flipped to the first page and felt his heart stop. It was Ellie's medical file. Everything was there. Her diagnosis, her treatment and history, the details of her condition, the recommended surgical procedure, the cost estimates, every scrap of information that the hospital had compiled over the past 4 years was documented in precise clinical language. Mason looked up at Caroline, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get this?" She did not answer. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, her back to him, gazing out at the city below. I can help your daughter, Mason. I can pay for the entire surgery. I can erase all your debts. I can give you and your child a new home, a new life. The words washed over him like a wave impossible to comprehend. He stared at her silhouette against the bright sky, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. Carolyn turned to face him, and for the first time he saw something beneath the ice. Not warmth exactly, but vulnerability. A crack in the armor she wore like a second skin. But in return, you must give me something. Something money cannot buy. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air thickened around Mason, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He gripped the arms of the chair, bracing himself for whatever came next. What do you want? Carolyn walked toward him slowly, her heels silent on the thick carpet. She stopped directly in front of his chair, close enough that he could see the faint lines around her eyes, the nearly imperceptible tension in her jaw. When she spoke, her voice was low and steady, each word falling like a stone dropped into still water. I want you to give me a child. Mason stared at her. His brain refused to process what he had just heard. A child. She wanted him to give her a child. The CEO of Aldrich Holdings, the most powerful woman in Texas, the billionaire heiress, who could have anything and anyone she wanted, was asking him, a janitor with a dying daughter, to father her child. I don't understand. You heard me perfectly well, Mr. Calloway. I do not like repeating myself. But why me? You could have anyone. You could adopt. You could use a surrogate. You could... Do you think I haven't tried? Caroline's voice cracked just slightly before she regained control. She walked back to her desk and opened another drawer, pulling out a second file. This one was even thicker than the first. 15 years, Mason. 15 years I have been searching for someone I could trust. She dropped the file onto the desk and papers spilled out. Photographs, contracts, investigation reports, background checks, the detritus of failed relationships and betrayed trust. The first was a lawyer from Dallas, handsome, charming, perfect on paper. Carolyn picked up a photograph of a smiling man in an expensive suit. 2 weeks before our engagement, I discovered he had secretly signed a deal with a rival firm. He was going to use the marriage to gain access to my company's confidential information. She tossed the photograph aside and picked up another. The second was a doctor. Respectable, brilliant. Everyone said he was perfect for me. What they didn't say was that he was simultaneously dating 3 other women, all of them wealthy, all of them searching for love, just like I was. Another photograph, another betrayal. Mason watched as Caroline cycled through the file, her voice growing harder with each story. The third was Richard Mercer, son of a prestigious family, old money, impeccable reputation. We were engaged for 8 months. I thought he was different. I thought he actually cared about me, not my fortune. She paused, and for a moment the mask slipped. Mason saw pain in her eyes, raw and unhealed, before she buried it again beneath the ice. One day before our wedding, I found a document in his briefcase, a prenuptial agreement he had hired his own lawyer to draft. If I had signed it, he would have gained control of 30% of my assets the moment we married. 30% of everything my father built. Everything I had spent my life protecting. Caroline returned to the window, her reflection visible in the glass. That was the day I understood the truth. No one wants me. They only want what I have. My name, my wealth, my power. No one sees Caroline. They only see the Aldrich name. The bitterness in her voice was palpable. Mason sat in silence, not knowing what to say, not knowing if there was anything that could be said. But you are different. She turned to face him, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him feel stripped bare. You are the only person in this building who has never wanted anything from me. You don't flatter me. You don't try to get close. You avoid looking at me whenever I pass by. I thought it was fear at first. But it isn't, is it? It's simply that you don't care who I am. I didn't think it was my place to look, ma'am. Exactly, that's honesty. And honesty in my world is rarer than diamonds. Carolyn walked toward him again, but this time she sat down in the chair beside his rather than standing above him. It was the first time he had ever seen her at haute level, and somehow it made her seem more human. less like a statue and more like a woman. I have been watching you for 8 months, Mason. You work hard. You never complain. You never steal, not even a pen. You come to work every night, even when you're exhausted, even when your daughter is sick, even when anyone else would have given up. And every night at exactly 11 o'clock, no matter what, you take a break to video call your daughter. Mason felt exposed, vulnerable. She knew everything about him. Every detail of his miserable little life had been cataloged and analyzed by this woman who controlled an empire. I also know about Dana, Carolyn continued, her voice softening slightly. I know when she left. I know with whom. I know where she is now. And I know that you have never said one bad word about her in front of your daughter. No matter what she did to you, no matter how much she deserved your hatred. Ellie doesn't need to know, Mason said, his voice barely audible. She's lost enough already. Carolyn looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. It was not warmth, not exactly, but something close to respect. That is why I chose you. You are not perfect. You are not wealthy. You are not powerful. But you are decent. And in a world full of liars and schemers and people who would sell their own mothers for the right price, decency is the most valuable thing I have ever encountered. She stood and returned to her desk, pulling out a contract from yet another drawer. The papers were covered in dense legal text paragraphs and clauses and terms that would have taken a team of lawyers to decipher. This is what I am offering, Mason. I will pay for your daughter's surgery. All $200,000 immediately. I will pay off your remaining debts, every last penny. I will provide you with a new apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools. I will set up a trust fund for Eleanor's future care and education. And in exchange, she placed the contract on the desk between them. In exchange, you will give me a child. You will not be involved in its upbringing. You will not have any legal claim to it. You will sign documents absolving yourself of all paternal rights and responsibilities. Once the child is born, you will disappear from my life with enough money to start over, and we will never speak of this arrangement again. Mason stared at the contract. His mind was racing, trying to process the enormity of what she was proposing. It was insane, impossible, the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real life. And yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was whispering. A voice that sounded like his mother, like his father, like every person who had ever told him that a man's got to do what a man's got to do. Why do you need a biological child? Mason asked, grasping for something concrete to focus on. Why can't you adopt? Because this isn't about having a child to love, Carolyn said, and for a moment the mask dropped completely. This is about survival. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of Aldrich Holdings. My father built this company from nothing. He sacrificed everything for it. His health, his marriage, his relationship with me. And when he had his stroke, when he became unable to run the company himself, he left it to me. His only child, his legacy. She pointed to a paragraph in the document highlighted in yellow. But he also left this, a provision in the company charter that gives the board of directors the right to challenge my leadership if I fail to produce an heir by the age of 45. They wanted to ensure the Aldrich bloodline would continue. They wanted to make sure the company would always stay in family hands. Mason read the paragraph, struggling to understand the legal jargon. And if you don't have an heir, then the board can vote to remove me as CEO. They can sell the company piece by piece to the highest bidder. Everything my father built, everything I have spent my entire adult life protecting will be dismantled and distributed among shareholders who care nothing for his vision. Can't you fight it? Challenge the provision in court? I've tried. My lawyers have tried. The provision is ironclad. My father made sure of that. Carolyn's voice was bitter. He thought he was protecting the family legacy. Instead, he created a ticking time bomb. How old are you now? 41. I have 4 years left to produce an heir, but... She hesitated, and Mason saw something flash across her face. Pain, fear, something she didn't want to admit. But what? Carolyn took a deep breath. I've been pregnant twice before. Both times ended in miscarriage. The doctors say my chances of carrying a pregnancy to term are extremely low, but not impossible. She looked at him, and for the first time, Mason saw the desperation beneath the ice, the loneliness, the terror of watching everything she had worked for slip through her fingers. You are my last chance, Mason. Not because I believe you are special or chosen or any other romantic nonsense, but because you are the only man I have ever met who has nothing to gain from deceiving me. You need money to save your daughter. I need a child to save my company. It is a simple transaction, nothing more. A simple transaction. The words echoed in Mason's head, as if creating a life could ever be simple, as if the act of fathering a child could ever be reduced to business terms. But was it really so different from what he was already doing? Every night he sold his labor to this company in exchange for money. He traded hours of his life for numbers on a paycheck that barely covered his rent. The only difference was the product being exchanged. What if I refuse? Caroline tilted her head, her expression unchanged. Then you walk away. This conversation never happened. You continue working as a janitor, and I continue searching for someone else. And your daughter, she paused, letting the implication hang in the air. That is not my concern. I am offering you a business deal, Mason, not charity. The words were cold, clinical, devoid of empathy, and yet Mason understood them in a way that surprised him. Carolyn Aldrich was not a monster. She was simply someone who had learned that emotions were a luxury she could not afford. Someone who had been betrayed so many times that trust had become a foreign concept. Someone who lived in a world where every relationship was a transaction and every kindness was a trap. In that moment, he pitied her. Despite her billions, despite her power, despite everything she had achieved, Caroline Aldrich was more alone than he had ever been. At least Mason had Ellie. At least he had his mother. At least he had someone who loved him for who he was, not what he could provide. Carolyn had no one. I need time to think. She nodded as if she had expected this response. You have 24 hours. After that, this offer expires and we never speak of it again. She stood and walked to the door, holding it open for him. The message was clear. The meeting was over. Mason rose from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. He walked toward the door, passing close enough to Caroline that he could smell her perfume again. Roses and something darker. Something that reminded him of autumn leaves and distant memories. At the threshold, he paused and turned back to face her. Why are you telling me all this? The board provision, the miscarriages, everything. You don't know me. I could go to the press. I could tell everyone. Carolyn met his gaze without flinching. You could, but you won't. How do you know? Because you are a decent man, Mason Calloway, and decent men don't betray people who are trying to help their dying daughters. She was right. He hated that she was right. But she was. Mason walked out of the office, past the secretary, past the photographs on the walls, past everything that represented a world he had never belonged to. He rode the elevator down in silence, his mind churning with questions and doubts and impossible choices. When he stepped out of the building and into the bright Texas morning, he felt like a man who had just woken from a dream. The streets were busy, with people rushing to work, living their ordinary lives, oblivious to the fact that somewhere on the 47th floor, a desperate woman had just offered a desperate man a chance to save his daughter at a price he wasn't sure he could pay. Mason walked to the bus stop and sat down on the bench. He pulled out his phone and stared at the cracked screen, at the picture of Ellie that served as his wallpaper. She was smiling in the photo, holding up a drawing she had made of a butterfly. It was from last summer, before her condition had worsened, before the coughing and the blue lips and the hospital visits became a regular occurrence. 24 hours. He had 24 hours to make a decision that would change everything. The bus arrived and Mason climbed aboard. He found a seat in the back and watched the city slide past the window. The hospital where Ellie was being monitored appeared briefly in the distance, its white walls gleaming in the morning sun. She was in there right now, fighting for her life, with every breath waiting for a miracle that might never come. Unless he made it come. The weight of the choice pressed down on Mason like a physical force. On one side were all the values he had been raised with. Honor, integrity, the belief that some lines should never be crossed no matter the circumstances. His father had lived his entire life by those principles, had died believing that a man's character was worth more than any amount of money. But his father had never had to watch his daughter die. Mason closed his eyes and leaned his head against the window. The glass was cold against his forehead, and he let the vibration of the bus engine rock him gently as it navigated through traffic. He thought about what his mother would say. Lorraine Calloway was a practical woman, hardened by decades of struggle and loss. She had buried her husband. She had watched her son's marriage collapse. She had moved into a cramped apartment to help care for a granddaughter whose condition seemed to worsen by the day. Would she tell him to refuse Caroline's offer and preserve his dignity? Or would she tell him that sometimes survival demanded sacrifices that felt impossible? He thought about Ellie, his beautiful, brave daughter, who still believed in happy endings, even though life had given her nothing but disappointment. She didn't know that her mother had abandoned her. She didn't know that her father worked nights scrubbing floors in a building owned by someone who could buy and sell their entire lives with pocket change. She didn't know how much he had sacrificed, how many pieces of himself he had given up just to keep her alive. And she didn't know that right now, at this very moment, he was considering giving up one more piece. But would it really be giving up something? Or would it be gaining something instead? $200,000 could pay for Ellie's surgery. It could clear their debts. It could give them a fresh start in a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood. It could give Ellie a future. And all it would cost was one act, one moment, one choice that Mason could bury deep inside himself and never think about again. Except he knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing was ever that simple. The child that resulted from this transaction would be his flesh and blood, his son or daughter growing up in Caroline Aldrich's world, raised by strangers, never knowing who their father was or why he had agreed to create them and then walk away. Could he live with that? Could he go through his life knowing that somewhere out there was a child who carried half his DNA, a child he had agreed to abandon before they were even conceived? The bus stopped and Mason realized he had reached his neighborhood. He stepped off and walked the 3 blocks to his building, barely noticing the trash strewn along the sidewalk or the sounds of argument drifting from open windows. His apartment was quiet when he entered. His mother was in the kitchen, washing dishes, and she looked up when he came through the door. "You're back early. Is everything okay?" Mason hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to lay out the impossible choice and ask for her guidance. But the words stuck in his throat. "I need to think about something, Mom. Can you stay with Ellie for a while longer?" Lorraine dried her hands on a towel and studied her son's face. She had known him for 34 years. She had seen him through every joy and every sorrow, and she could tell that something was very wrong. "Whatever it is, Mason, you can tell me. I know, I need some time alone." She nodded slowly, accepting his need for space even though it clearly worried her. "I'll be here. Ellie should sleep for a few more hours. The hospital said her readings were stable this morning." Mason thanked her and retreated to his bedroom, closing the door behind him. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall, at the peeling paint and the water stains on the ceiling, at all the evidence of a life that had gone wrong in ways he never could have predicted. 24 hours. He lay back on the mattress and closed his eyes, trying to quiet the chaos in his mind. The image of Caroline Aldrich floated before him, her cold blue eyes, her perfect suit, the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide beneath her armor of wealth and power. She was lonely. That was the truth he had seen in her office, the truth she probably didn't even admit to herself. Behind the billions in the boardrooms and the business deals was a woman who had never been loved for who she was. A woman who had been betrayed by everyone she had ever trusted. A woman who was so afraid of connection that she had reduced the most intimate act of creation to a contract and a handshake. Mason understood loneliness. He had lived with it for 3 years, ever since Dana walked out the door. But at least he had Ellie. At least he had someone to love and be loved by. Carolyn had no one. And despite everything, despite the impossible offer and the cold demands and the way she looked at him like he was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known, Mason felt something stir in his chest. Pity, or maybe compassion, or maybe something else entirely that he didn't want to examine too closely. The hours passed. Mason drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with fragmented images. Ellie laughing in a sunlit garden. Caroline standing alone in her empty office. His father's face worn and tired, telling him that a man is measured not by what he takes, but by what he gives. When he woke, the afternoon light was slanting through his window, and his phone was buzzing with a notification. The hospital reminding him of Ellie's upcoming appointment. Another piece of the puzzle. Another thread pulling him toward a decision he wasn't ready to make. He got up and splashed water on his face, then walked out to the living room. His mother was sitting on the couch knitting something in soft yellow yarn. She looked up when he appeared. Feeling better? Not really. Mason sat down beside her, watching her hands move with practiced ease. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. If you had a chance to save someone you loved, but that chance required you to do something you weren't sure was right, what would you do? Lorraine's hands stilled. She looked at her son with eyes that had seen too much, understood too much. What are we really talking about here, Mason? He took a deep breath. I met someone wealthy, very wealthy. They offered to pay for Ellie's surgery, all of it plus more. But they want something in return. Something I'm not sure I can give. Is it illegal? No. Will it hurt anyone? Mason thought about the question. Would it hurt anyone? Carolyn would get what she wanted. Ellie would get what she needed. The only one who might be hurt was the child. The one who would never know their father. The one who would grow up wondering why they had been created through a transaction rather than love. But did that count as hurt? Children were born into worse circumstances every day. At least this one would have wealth, security, opportunity. I don't know, he finally admitted. I don't know if it will hurt anyone or not. Lorraine set down her knitting and took her son's hands in hers. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, the tremors from her Parkinson's making her fingers shake slightly, but her voice was steady. You know what your father died of, don't you? Lung cancer. He worked at the shop too long breathing in all those fumes. That's the medical answer, but the real answer is that he died of principles. Lorraine's eyes grew distant, remembering. Your father was the kindest man I ever knew. He never cheated anyone. He never took shortcuts. He never compromised, not once, not even when it would have made our lives easier. She paused and her voice grew thick with emotion. And he died in the cheapest hospital room they had because we couldn't afford better care. He died surrounded by machines instead of family because I had to work that night to cover the bills. He died alone, Mason. The most decent man I ever knew, and he died alone because he was too proud to accept help when it was offered. Mason felt tears prick at his eyes. He remembered those final days, the sterile smell of the hospital, the beeping monitors, his father's hand, thin and fragile, gripping his with surprising strength. I loved your father, Lorraine continued. I respected him, I was proud of him, but sometimes in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, I wonder if he had been a little more flexible, a little more willing to bend. Would he still be here? Would he be sitting beside me now, watching his granddaughter grow up? She squeezed Mason's hands. I don't know what this person wants from you. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I know one thing. She turned her head toward Ellie's room, where the soft hum of medical equipment could be heard through the wall. That child in there is all we have left. She's the last piece of our family, the last hope for our future. And if there's a way to save her, a way that doesn't require you to sell your soul to the devil. She met his eyes, her gaze fierce and determined. Then think very carefully before turning it down. Mason sat in silence, absorbing his mother's words. She had not told him what to do. She had simply given him permission to consider options he might otherwise have dismissed. Was that what he needed permission? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mason checked on Ellie, who was awake and asking for stories. He read to her for an hour, letting the familiar rhythms of fairy tales and happy endings carry them both to a place where problems had solutions and heroes always saved the day. When she finally fell asleep, her small hand curled around his finger. Mason stood by her bed and watched her breathe. In and out, each breath a tiny miracle. He thought about Caroline's offer, $200,000, a new home, a fresh start, all for the price of one act, one choice, one crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. And he thought about what his mother had said, about principles, about flexibility, about the difference between surviving and living. His father had been a good man, the best man Mason had ever known. But his goodness had not saved him. It had not protected him from disease or poverty or the cruel indifference of a world that cared nothing for honor. Mason loved his father. He wanted to be like him. But he did not want to die like him. And he did not want Ellie to grow up without a father because he had been too proud to accept help when it was offered. The decision crystallized in his mind with sudden clarity. It was not a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between two kinds of sacrifice. He could sacrifice his principles and save his daughter, Or he could preserve his principles and watch her die. Put like that, there was really only one answer. Mason walked to the window and looked out at the Austin night. The city lights glittered against the darkness, millions of people living their lives, making their choices, carrying their burdens. Somewhere out there in her massive office on the 47th floor, Caroline Aldrich was waiting for his answer. He pulled out his phone and found the business card her secretary had given him, the personal number of the most powerful woman in Texas. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment. Then he pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Have you made your decision?" Her voice was exactly as he remembered. Cold, controlled, giving nothing away. Mason took a deep breath and looked at Ellie's closed door, imagining his daughter sleeping peacefully behind it, her damaged heart struggling with every beat. "Yes, I agree." Silence stretched across the line. Then Caroline's voice came again, unchanged in tone, despite the magnitude of what he had just agreed to. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, I will send someone to pick you up." The call ended before he could say anything else. Mason stood in the darkness, the phone still pressed to his ear, feeling as if he had just stepped off a cliff and was now falling through empty space. He had made his choice. There was no going back. The car arrived at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows that looked completely out of place in his rundown neighborhood. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door without saying a word. Mason had been awake since before dawn. He had showered, put on his best clothes, and sat in the kitchen drinking coffee he couldn't taste, waiting for the sun to rise and his new life to begin. Before leaving, he stopped in Ellie's room. She was still sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo, memorizing the feeling of her warm skin against his lips. "I'm doing this for you," he whispered. "Everything I'm doing is for you." He told his mother he had an important meeting and would be back later. Lorraine watched him go with worried eyes, but she did not ask questions. She trusted her son to do what was necessary, even when she didn't know what that was. The Mercedes glided through the streets of Austin like a shark moving through water. Mason sat in the back watching the familiar landmarks of his life pass by the window. The grocery store where he bought Ellie's medicine. The park where he used to take her to feed the ducks before she got too sick to leave home. The bus stop where he waited every night for the ride to work. Soon those landmarks gave way to something else. The buildings grew taller, the streets wider, the people better dressed. And then they were in Westlake Hills, the most exclusive neighborhood in Austin, where mansions hid behind tall gates and security cameras tracked every movement. The car turned onto a private road that wound through perfectly manicured grounds. Oak trees lined the path, their branches creating a canopy of green that filtered the morning sunlight. At the end of the road stood a mansion that made Mason's breath catch in his throat. It was enormous. White stone walls, soaring columns, massive windows that reflected the sky like mirrors. A circular driveway surrounded a fountain that would have looked at home in a European palace. The building was 3 stories tall with wings that extended in both directions and grounds that seemed to stretch to the horizon. This was where Caroline Aldrich lived. This was the world she inhabited. And for the next however long, this was where Mason would be. The driver opened the door and Mason stepped out into a reality that felt like a dream. A woman in a housekeeper's uniform was waiting at the front entrance, her face neutral and professional. "Mr. Calloway, I'm Margaret. Mrs. Aldrich is waiting for you in the sitting room. This way, please." Mason followed her through the front door and into an entry hall that made his apartment look like a closet. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished to such a shine that he could see his reflection in them. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its 1,000 facets catching the light and scattering rainbows across the walls. Oil paintings lined the corridor, each one probably worth more than everything Mason had ever owned combined. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of flowers from arrangements placed strategically throughout the space. But beneath the beauty, there was something else. Something empty. Something cold. No laughter echoed through these halls. No voices called from room to room. No evidence of life or warmth or human connection anywhere Mason looked. Margaret led him through a series of rooms, each more opulent than the last, until they reached a sitting area near the back of the house. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a manicured lawn that sloped down to a pool so blue it hurt to look at. Beyond the pool, the city of Austin spread out in the distance, its skyline looking small and insignificant from this height. Carolyn was sitting in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, a cup of tea in her hand. She wore a light gray dress that accentuated her figure without revealing anything, and her blonde hair hung loosely around her shoulders instead of in its usual severe bun. The effect was startling. She looked almost human. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Mason sat. The cushion was incredibly soft, molding to his body like it had been designed specifically for him. Everything in this house seemed designed to maximize comfort, yet nothing about the situation felt comfortable at all. "Have you eaten breakfast?" The question caught him off guard. "No, ma'am." Carolyn nodded to Margaret, who disappeared through a doorway. A few minutes later, she returned with a rolling cart loaded with food. Fresh toast, fruit, pastries. Dishes that Mason didn't recognize, but that smelled incredible. "Eat," Carolyn said. "You'll need your strength." Mason didn't understand what she meant, but he was too hungry to refuse. He picked up a slice of toast and began eating, trying to keep his movements polite and controlled despite the urge to devour everything in sight. Carolyn watched him eat without touching any food herself. Her blue eyes tracked his every movement, cataloging details, analyzing behavior. He felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Today will be a day of preparation," she said when he had finished. "Dr. Harrison Cole will arrive this afternoon to perform a complete health examination. Blood tests, physical evaluation. Everything necessary to ensure you are fit for what lies ahead." Mason nodded. It made sense. If she was planning to have a child with him, she would want to make sure there were no genetic defects or health problems that could complicate things. "After the medical examination, my lawyer will have you sign several documents. Non-disclosure agreements, legal releases. Everything will be explained to you in detail. If you break any of the terms, you will face severe legal consequences. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good." Carolyn set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap. "Do you have any questions? Any concerns you wish to raise before we proceed?" Mason thought about the 1,000 questions swirling in his mind, about the child they were about to create, about what would happen after it was born, about how he was supposed to live with himself, once this was all over. But instead he asked something else entirely. "Why me?" Carolyn's expression didn't change. "I believe I explained that in my office. You explained why you ruled everyone else out, but you didn't explain why you chose me specifically. There must be thousands of decent men in Texas. Why a janitor who cleans your floors?" For a long moment, Carolyn didn't answer. She turned her gaze toward the window, looking out at the perfect lawn and the sparkling pool and the city glittering in the distance. "Because you have something I have never had," she finally said. "Something I have wanted my entire life." "What?" She turned back to face him, and for just a moment the mask slipped. Beneath the ice, Mason saw something raw, something painful, something that looked almost like longing. "Someone who loves you without wanting anything in return." The words hung in the air between them. Mason thought of Ellie, of her small hand in his, of the way she looked at him like he was the center of the universe. He thought of his mother, who had given up her comfortable retirement to help him care for his daughter. He thought of all the people who had stood by him even when he had nothing to offer in return. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, just how impoverished Caroline Aldrich really was. "I hope you find that someday," he said quietly. "I hope someone loves you the way you deserve to be loved." Carolyn stared at him, her blue eyes wide with something that might have been shock. Then she blinked and the mask snapped back into place. "I didn't bring you here for sentiment, Mr. Calloway. I brought you here to fulfill a contract. Shall we proceed?" Mason nodded, accepting the deflection for what it was. She wasn't ready to be seen. Maybe she would never be ready, but that was not his concern. He was here for Ellie. He was here to save his daughter. Whatever else happened was beyond his control. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medical tests and legal documents. Dr. Cole arrived at noon with a team of nurses and equipment that looked like it belonged in a hospital rather than a private home. They drew blood. They checked his heart. They asked questions about his family history, his diet, his lifestyle, his past relationships. Mason answered everything, honestly feeling more exposed with each passing hour. When the medical team finally left, the lawyers arrived. Three of them all in identical dark suits, all carrying briefcases bulging with papers. They led Mason to a formal conference room and proceeded to walk him through a stack of documents that seemed to grow taller every time he looked at it. The non-disclosure agreement was the first and most important. It stated in no uncertain terms that Mason could never reveal the nature of his arrangement with Caroline Aldrich to anyone. Not the press, not his family, not future partners, not anyone ever under penalty of financial ruin and criminal prosecution. The paternity waiver came next. It stated that Mason was voluntarily surrendering all legal rights to any child resulting from his relationship with Caroline. He would have no claim to custody, visitation, or involvement of any kind. He would be a stranger to his own offspring forever and completely. The financial agreement followed. It outlined exactly what Mason would receive in exchange for his participation. $200,000 for Ellie's surgery transferred immediately. Payment of all outstanding debts. A new apartment in a safe neighborhood. A trust fund for Ellie's future care. And a final lump sum of $1 million to be delivered upon the successful birth of a healthy child. $1 million. The number seemed unreal. Impossible. More money than Mason had ever dreamed of possessing. But there was a condition. The million would only be paid if the child was born healthy and if Mason complied with all terms of the agreement. If he violated any clause, if he spoke to anyone about their arrangement, if he attempted to contact the child at any point in the future, he would forfeit everything. The surgery money would become a loan that he would be obligated to repay. The debts would be reinstated. He would be left with nothing except the knowledge of what he had done. The lawyers waited while Mason read through every page, every paragraph, every word. They answered his questions in clinical, detached tones, treating the creation of a human life like any other business transaction. Because to them, that's exactly what it was. When he finally signed the last document, his hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. The lawyers gathered their papers, shook his hand, and departed, leaving him alone in the conference room, with the weight of what he had done pressing down on his shoulders. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty table, wondering if he had just sold his soul. That evening, Margaret showed him to a guest room on the second floor. It was larger than his entire apartment, with a king-size bed covered in silk sheets, a private bathroom with a marble tub, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. Fresh clothes had been laid out for him, expensive things in his exact size that someone must have purchased specifically for this occasion. Mason stood at the window, looking out at the estate spread before him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and the lights of Austin were beginning to twinkle in the distance. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And he had never felt more alone. A knock came at the door. Margaret appeared with a tray of food and the message that Mrs. Aldrich would like to see him in her study at 9 o'clock. Mason ate without tasting. He showered and changed into the new clothes. And at exactly 9 o'clock, he walked down the hallway to Caroline's study. She was sitting behind a massive desk surrounded by screens and documents and all the trappings of someone who ran an empire. When he entered, she looked up and gestured for him to close the door. "The medical results are in," she said without preamble. "You're in excellent health, no genetic markers for concern. Dr. Cole says we can begin whenever we're ready." Begin. Such a simple word for such an enormous thing. "When do you want to start?" Carolyn stood and walked around the desk, stopping a few feet in front of him. In the soft light of the study, she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, less like a billionaire CEO, and more like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump. "The question is not when I want to start," she said quietly. "The question is whether you are prepared for what comes next." Mason met her gaze. Her blue eyes searched his face, looking for something. Doubt, fear, regret. He showed her none of those things. Because in that moment, standing in the study of a woman who had everything except the one thing she truly wanted, Mason Calloway made peace with his choice. "I'm ready," he said, and the journey that would change both their lives forever began. The first week inside Caroline Aldrich's mansion passed like a fever dream. Mason moved through rooms that seemed to stretch into infinity, ate meals prepared by chefs whose names he never learned, and slept in a bed so comfortable it felt like drowning in clouds. Every morning he woke expecting to find himself back in his cramped apartment, the whole experience revealed as nothing more than an elaborate hallucination. But every morning the silk sheets reminded him that this was real. All of it was terrifyingly real. During the days, Carolyn vanished into her world of meetings and conference calls and decisions that moved millions. She would leave before dawn and return after dark, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she passed through the house like a ghost. Sometimes Mason caught glimpses of her through doorways, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and commanding as she navigated whatever crisis had emerged that hour. In those moments, she seemed untouchable, unreachable, a creature from another dimension entirely. But the nights were different. The nights belonged to the arrangement. Mason had expected something clinical, mechanical, a transaction conducted with the same cold efficiency that characterized everything else in Carolyn's world. He had prepared himself to be used and discarded, a tool for achieving an objective rather than a person to be considered. What he found instead was something far more complicated. The first night Caroline came to him in her bedroom, she wore a black silk robe that fell to her knees, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare against the thick carpet. Without the armor of her business suits and severe hairstyles, she looked almost fragile, almost human. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him with those unreadable blue eyes. Mason sat on the edge of the bed, his heart pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it from across the room. "You don't have to be nervous." Her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "This is a business arrangement. Nothing more." "I know what it is." "Then why do you look at me like you're afraid I might break?" Mason considered the question. The truth was complicated. He was not afraid of Caroline. He was afraid of himself, afraid of what he was about to do, afraid of the line he was about to cross and the person he might become on the other side. "Maybe because I think you might." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition. She crossed the room slowly and sat beside him on the bed, close enough that he could smell her perfume, roses and something darker. Autumn leaves and distant memories. "I have survived things that would destroy most people, Mason. I have been betrayed by everyone I ever trusted. I have buried my mother, watched my father become a shell of himself, lost 2 pregnancies that I wanted more than anything in the world." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I am not fragile. I am not breakable. I am simply tired of pretending that none of it ever hurt." Mason looked at her, really looked at her, past the billions and the boardrooms and the reputation for ruthlessness, past the ice and the armor and the walls she had built to keep the world at bay. And he saw a woman, just a woman, lonely and afraid and desperate for something she had never been able to find. "Then stop pretending." The words came out before he could stop them. "At least with me, at least in this room. You don't have to be Caroline Aldrich in here. You can just be Caroline Shum." She stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly the mask began to slip. The tension in her shoulders eased. The hard line of her jaw softened. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't remember how." "Then let me help you remember." That night, something shifted between them. It was not love. Mason knew the difference between love and whatever this was. Love was what he felt for Ellie, the bone-deep devotion that would have made him walk through fire to keep her safe. This was something else, something stranger. A connection forged in mutual desperation, 2 drowning people clinging to each other in the darkness. But it was real, and in the hollow emptiness of Caroline's mansion, real was more than either of them had expected to find. The days fell into a rhythm. Every morning, Mason video called Ellie at the hospital. She had been transferred to a private room at St. David's, the best facility in Austin, with round-the-clock nursing care and every comfort money could buy. The surgery was scheduled for the end of the month. Until then, she was being monitored and stabilized, her tiny body prepared for the ordeal to come. "Daddy, my room has a TV that goes on the ceiling." Ellie's voice bubbled with excitement through the phone speaker. "And the nurse brings me ice cream every day. Chocolate chip is my favorite." "That sounds amazing, sweetheart. Are you being good for Grandma?" "The best. She tells me stories about when you were little. Did you really fall in a mud puddle at your 5th birthday party?" Mason laughed, the sound strange in the cavernous silence of the mansion. "That was supposed to be a secret." "Grandma says there are no secrets in families. Only stories waiting to be told." The words echoed in Mason's mind long after the call ended. Secrets. His entire life had become a secret now. The mansion he lived in, the woman he slept beside, the arrangement that was paying for Ellie's survival. None of it could ever be spoken aloud. He wondered if Ellie would understand when she was older. He wondered if she would forgive him. The weeks passed. Caroline's schedule remained brutal, but she began carving out small pockets of time for something other than work. A dinner eaten together instead of at her desk. A walk through the gardens in the fading evening light. Conversations that stretched past midnight, covering everything from childhood memories to political philosophy to the best way to cook a perfect steak. Mason learned things about her that contradicted everything the rumor said. She was not cold, she was guarded, she was not ruthless, she was efficient, she was not incapable of feeling. She had simply learned to hide her feelings so deeply that even she sometimes forgot they existed. And Caroline learned things about him, about his father, the mechanic who taught him that a man's worth was measured in calluses and character. About his mother, the quiet force who held the family together through every storm. About Dana, the woman he had loved and lost and still couldn't bring himself to hate despite everything she had done. You should hate her. Caroline's voice was matter of fact as they sat together one evening in the library. She abandoned your daughter. She betrayed your marriage. She left you to carry everything alone. Hating her won't change anything. It won't make Ellie better. It won't undo what happened. It would just be another weight to carry, and I'm already carrying enough. Caroline turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. You are a very strange man, Mason Calloway. So you keep telling me. Most people in your position would be consumed by bitterness. They would rage against the unfairness of it all. They would demand that the universe acknowledge their suffering. And what would that accomplish? The universe doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about suffering. It just is. The only thing we can control is how we respond to it. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. I wish I could see the world the way you do. I wish I could let go of all the anger and resentment I've carried for so long. But I don't know how. Maybe you just need someone to show you. Their eyes met and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of something. The first green shoots pushing through frozen ground. Dr. Cole came to the mansion every week to monitor Caroline's health. The early results were promising. Her hormone levels were optimal. Her body was responding well to the treatments. All signs pointed toward a successful conception. On the fourth week, the news came. Caroline was sitting in her study when Dr. Cole emerged from his examination room, his face carefully neutral. Mason stood in the doorway watching his heart lodge somewhere in his throat. The test is positive. Dr. Cole's voice was calm, professional. You're pregnant, Mrs. Aldrich. Approximately 3 weeks along. The words hung in the air like something physical. Mason watched Caroline's face, searching for a reaction. Joy, fear, triumph, anything. What he saw was none of those things. What he saw was hope. Raw, unguarded hope that transformed her features into something almost unrecognizable. You're certain? I ran the test twice to be sure. Congratulations. Dr. Cole gathered his things and departed, leaving instructions for prenatal care and follow-up appointments. Margaret showed him out, and suddenly Mason and Caroline were alone. She sat behind her desk perfectly still, staring at nothing. Her hands rested on her stomach, fingers spread wide as if trying to feel something that was still far too small to detect. It worked. Her voice was barely audible. After everything, after all the failures, it actually worked. Mason crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his. Her skin was cold, her fingers trembling. How are you feeling? Terrified. The word came out as a whisper. Happy, confused, all of it at once. That sounds about right. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since they met, there were tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, tears of something far more complicated. I don't know how to do this, Mason. I don't know how to be a mother. I never had a model for it. My own mother died when I was 12. My father was always working. I raised myself, essentially. How am I supposed to raise someone else? The same way everyone does, one day at a time, one mistake at a time, learning as you go. What if I fail? What if I'm terrible at it? What if I damage this child the way I was damaged? Mason squeezed her hand. Then you'll try again, and again, and again. That's what being a parent is. Failing and trying and failing and trying until somehow, miraculously, you get something right. Carolyn stared at him, her blue eyes searching his face. Will you help me? The question caught him off guard. This was not part of the arrangement. The contract specified that Mason would have no involvement with the child after birth. He was supposed to disappear, vanish into his new life with his $1 million and his healthy daughter and his clean conscience. But looking at Caroline now, seeing the fear and hope warring in her eyes, Mason knew he could not simply walk away. Whatever had begun between them had grown into something larger than a business transaction, something that could not be reduced to contracts and signatures and legal terms. I'll help you however I can, for as long as you need me. She did not smile. Carolyn Aldrich did not smile easily, but something in her expression softened, and she nodded once, accepting his promise for what it was. The following weeks brought changes that neither of them anticipated. Carolyn's pregnancy progressed smoothly, but her absence from the office did not go unnoticed. The board of directors, those old men who had worked with her father and resented taking orders from his daughter, began to ask questions. It started with small things, rescheduled meetings, declined invitations, the occasional email that went unanswered for longer than usual. But small things had a way of becoming large things in the corporate world, and soon the whispers began. Something's wrong with Aldrich. She's losing her edge. Maybe it's time for new leadership. The loudest voice belonged to Henderson Pierce, the vice chairman of the board. He was 63 years old, silver-haired and silver-tongued, with the easy charm of a man who had spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted. He had been William Aldrich's closest friend and advisor. He had expected to run the company himself when William fell ill. Instead, he had been forced to watch a 26-year-old girl take the reins, and 15 years of resentment had done nothing to dull his ambition. Henderson came to the mansion one afternoon unannounced and uninvited. Margaret showed him to the sitting room where Caroline was reviewing documents, and Mason watched from the hallway as the older man settled into a chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed he owned the space. "Carolyn, my dear, you look well." "Henderson, I wasn't expecting you." "I know, that's rather the point." He crossed his legs and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The board is concerned. You've missed 3 meetings in the past month. Your response times have slowed. There are rumors circulating about your health." "My health is fine." "Is it because the Caroline I know would never let anything interfere with her work? The Caroline I know would crawl through broken glass to make a board meeting. Something has changed, and as vice chairman, I have an obligation to understand what." Caroline's expression remained neutral, but Mason could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight whitening of her knuckles as she gripped the armrest. "I appreciate your concern, Henderson, but I assure you everything is under control." "Is it because I've heard some interesting things lately about visitors to this mansion, about medical equipment being delivered, about a certain janitor from the headquarters who seems to have disappeared from his position right around the time you started acting strangely?" Mason's blood ran cold. Henderson knew, or suspected enough to be dangerous. Caroline's face betrayed nothing. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm simply observing and asking myself what could possibly cause the most driven woman I know to suddenly become so distracted." He leaned forward, his smile sharpening into something predatory. "If there's something you want to tell me, Caroline, now would be the time, before the rest of the board starts asking the same questions I'm asking." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Mason held his breath, waiting. Then Caroline stood, her movement smooth and controlled, and walked to the window. When she turned back to face Henderson, her expression was ice. "The only thing I want to tell you, Henderson, is that I am the CEO of Aldrich Holdings. I own 52% of this company. Whatever changes you think you have observed, whatever rumors you have heard, whatever theories you've concocted, none of them matter. Because at the end of the day, I answer to no one. Not the board, not the shareholders, and certainly not you." Henderson's smile flickered but did not fade. "Of course, my dear. I meant no offense. I simply wanted to express the board's concerns and offer my support during what is clearly a difficult time." "Your support is noted. Margaret will show you out." He rose, straightening his jacket, his eyes never leaving Caroline's face. I hope you know what you're doing, Caroline. Your father would be devastated to see everything he built torn apart because of poor judgment. My father taught me to trust no one who offers unsolicited advice, particularly those who stand to benefit from my failure. Henderson's eyes hardened for just a moment before the mask of civility slipped back into place. We'll speak again soon, I'm sure, Merton. Take care of yourself. He left, and the mansion fell silent. Carolyn remained at the window, her back to the room, her shoulders rigid with suppressed tension. Mason stepped into the sitting room. He knows something. He suspects, which is almost worse. She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes. Henderson has been waiting 15 years for an opportunity to take this company from me. If he finds out about the pregnancy, about you, about any of this, he'll use it to destroy me. What can we do? I don't know. She pressed a hand to her stomach, the gesture now automatic. I've spent my entire adult life controlling every variable, anticipating every threat, staying 3 steps ahead of everyone who wanted to see me fail. But this, she shook her head, this I cannot control. This is bigger than business strategies and legal maneuvering. This is my life. This is everything. Mason crossed the room and took her hands in his. Then we'll figure it out together. Whatever Henderson is planning, whatever the board is scheming, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Caroline. Remember. She looked at him, her blue eyes glistening. I'm not used to having someone stand with me. Everyone I've ever trusted has either left or betrayed me. Then get used to something new. The surgery came on a Tuesday. Mason sat in the waiting room of St. David's Hospital, his leg bouncing with nervous energy, his eyes fixed on the doors that led to the operating theater. Lorraine sat beside him, her trembling hand clasped in his, her lips moving in silent prayer. They had been there for 3 hours already. The surgery was supposed to take 6 to 8 depending on complications. The doctors had explained everything in detail, the risks and probabilities and potential outcomes, but none of it mattered now. All that mattered was the little girl behind those doors, her chest cut open, her broken heart laid bare. Carolyn had wanted to come. She had insisted actually, despite the risk of being seen, despite the questions it might raise. But Mason had convinced her to stay at the mansion. The last thing Ellie needed was the stress of a stranger in the waiting room, and the last thing Caroline needed was to be photographed at a children's hospital while visibly pregnant. So she waited at home, sending texts every hour asking for updates, and Mason sat in the sterile waiting room with his mother, watching the clock tick away the longest day of his life. She's going to be okay. Lorraine's voice was thin but steady. She's a fighter, that girl, just like her daddy. I know, Mom, I know. But knowing and believing were different things. Mason had spent so long preparing for the worst that he had forgotten how to hope for the best. Every good thing in his life had been followed by something terrible. Every moment of joy had been cut short by tragedy. He was afraid to let himself believe that this time might be different. The hours dragged on. Nurses came and went, their faces carefully neutral, offering no information beyond the standard reassurances. Everything is proceeding normally. The doctors are doing their best. We'll let you know as soon as there's news. At the 5-hour mark, Mason's phone buzzed with a message from Caroline. Any word? Nothing yet. Still waiting. A pause. Then another message. I'm thinking of her. And of you. Mason stared at the words, feeling something shift in his chest. Caroline Aldrich, the Ice Queen of Texas, was she all? The woman who had reduced the creation of life to a business contract was sitting at home thinking about his daughter. Thank you, he typed back. That means more than you know. At the 7-hour mark, the doors finally opened. Dr. Morrison emerged, still wearing his surgical scrubs, his face lined with exhaustion, but carrying something that looked almost like a smile. Mr. Calloway. Mason was on his feet before the words finished, leaving the doctor's mouth. How is she? Is she okay? Did something go wrong? The surgery was successful. The words hit Mason like a physical force. His knees buckled, and he would have fallen if Lorraine hadn't grabbed his arm. Successful, the defects have been repaired. Her heart is functioning normally. She'll need time to recover, of course, and there will be follow-up care required, but Dr. Morrison's smile widened. Your daughter is going to be okay, Mr. Calloway. She's going to live. Mason didn't remember falling. He didn't remember the tears streaming down his face, or the sobs racking his body, or the way Lorraine held him as 34 years of fear and hope and desperate prayer came pouring out all at once. All he knew was that Ellie was alive. His daughter was alive. The nightmare that had consumed him for 4 years was finally miraculously over. He called Caroline from the hospital corridor, his voice still shaking, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to share the news. She made it. The surgery was successful. She's going to be okay. Silence on the other end. Then so quietly he almost missed it, the sound of Caroline crying. "I'm so happy for you, Mason. I'm so happy for both of you. Thank you for everything, for the surgery, for the doctors, for all of it. I can never repay you. You already have." Her voice was thick with emotion. "You've given me something I never thought I would have. A chance at a future, a reason to hope. That's worth more than any amount of money." Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past months settle around him like a blanket. So much had happened. So much had changed. He had entered Caroline's world as a desperate father, willing to do anything to save his child. He was leaving it as something else entirely, something he didn't yet have a name for. "I should go. They're letting me see her soon." "Of course. Give Ellie my love. Tell her—" Carolyn hesitated. "Tell her that a friend is thinking of her." "I will." He ended the call and walked back to the waiting room where his mother was already gathering their things. In a few minutes they would be allowed into recovery. In a few hours Ellie would open her eyes. And in a few days, if everything continued to go well, she would come home. Home. The word felt different now. Heavier. More complicated. Because Mason was no longer sure where home was, or who he was supposed to be, or what would happen when the contracts expired and the arrangement ended and real life came crashing back in. But those were problems for another day. Right now, in this moment, his daughter was alive. His daughter was going to grow up. His daughter was going to have a future. And that was enough. For now, that was more than enough. The recovery room smelled of antiseptic and hope. Mason sat beside Ellie's bed, watching the monitors track each heartbeat with steady green lines that meant everything was working. Everything was healing. Everything was finally impossibly going to be okay. Ellie had woken twice since the surgery. The first time she managed only a groggy smile before the sedatives pulled her back under. The second time she reached for Mason's hand and whispered something that sounded like "Daddy" before her eyes fluttered closed again. Both times Mason felt tears streaming down his face. Both times he made no effort to stop them. Lorraine had gone home to rest, promising to return in the morning with fresh clothes and Ellie's favorite stuffed rabbit. The hospital had offered Mason a cot in the corner of the room, but he couldn't bring himself to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ellie on that operating table, her small chest open, her fragile heart exposed to the cold fluorescent lights. The image would haunt him for years to come, but it was a small price to pay for the gift of watching her breathe. His phone buzzed with another message from Caroline. "How is she sleeping peacefully? Doctors say everything looks good. I'm glad. Get some rest yourself. You need it." Mason smiled at the screen, Caroline Aldrich ordering him to take care of himself. The woman who worked 20-hour days and survived on coffee and willpower was lecturing him about rest. The irony was not lost on him. "I'll try. How are you feeling?" A pause, then nauseous, exhausted, terrified. Normal pregnancy symptoms, apparently. Mason typed back, "Welcome to parenthood." The response came quickly. "I'm beginning to understand why people find it so overwhelming." He set the phone aside and turned back to Ellie. Her color was better than it had been in months. The grayish pallor that had haunted her skin was fading, replaced by the faintest hint of pink. Her breathing was steady, no longer the labored gasps that had kept him awake so many nights. She looked peaceful. She looked healthy. She looked like a child with a future. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hospital routines and incremental progress. Ellie grew stronger with each passing hour. She graduated from the recovery room to a regular ward from intravenous fluids, to solid food from lying flat on her back, to sitting up and demanding cartoons. The nurses adored her. The doctors marveled at her resilience. And Mason sat beside her through all of it, reading stories and playing games and making up for all the moments he had missed while working night shifts at Aldrich Holdings. "Daddy, when can I go home?" The question came on the fifth day, delivered with the impatience of a 6-year-old who had grown tired of hospital beds and institutional meals. Soon, sweetheart, the doctors want to make sure you're completely healed first. But I feel fine. My chest doesn't even hurt anymore. That's the medicine talking. You need to let your body rest. Ellie crossed her arms and pouted a gesture so perfectly normal that Mason had to fight back tears. A week ago, she barely had the strength to lift her head. Now she was arguing about discharge dates and complaining about hospital food. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Will I have to come back? To the hospital, I mean. Sometimes, for checkups, the doctors want to make sure your heart stays healthy. But no more surgery. No more surgery, baby. That part is over. She considered this for a moment, her blue eyes serious. Good. I didn't like being asleep for so long. I had weird dreams. What kind of dreams? I dreamed about a pretty lady with yellow hair. She was standing by my bed watching me. She looked sad. Mason's heart skipped. A lady with yellow hair. She had blue eyes like mine, and she smelled like flowers. Caroline. Somehow impossibly, Ellie had dreamed about Caroline, a woman she had never met, a woman whose existence she couldn't possibly know about. Did the lady say anything? Ellie shook her head. She just watched, and then she put her hand on my chest right here. She pointed to the bandage covering her incision, and she said something really quiet. I couldn't hear it, but I think she was praying. Mason sat in stunned silence. He didn't believe in supernatural connections or mystical bonds between strangers. He was a practical man who dealt in concrete realities. But hearing his daughter describe the woman whose money had saved her life, the woman who was carrying his child, the woman who waited at home sending hourly messages asking for updates, it shook something loose inside him. That sounds like a nice dream, sweetheart. It was. I felt safe when she was there. Ellie yawned, her energy fading. Daddy, is the yellow-haired lady real? Mason brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Get some sleep, princess. We can talk about it later. She nodded and closed her eyes asleep within seconds. Mason sat beside her, staring at the wall, wondering what it meant. Wondering if it meant anything at all. Ellie was discharged on the 8th day. The doctors provided detailed instructions for her recovery medications to take activities to avoid warning signs to watch for. A home health nurse would visit 3 times a week to monitor her progress. Follow-up appointments were scheduled for the next 6 months. Everything was organized, planned, accounted for. The new apartment was waiting for them. Caroline had arranged everything while Mason was at the hospital. A 2-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood near good schools, fully furnished and stocked with groceries. The rent was paid for a year in advance. A trust fund had been established in Ellie's name, enough to cover her medical care and education through college. Everything Mason had dreamed of during those desperate nights of cleaning office floors was suddenly impossibly real. He carried Ellie through the front door and set her gently on the couch. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the clean walls and new furniture and the window that looked out onto a tree-lined street instead of a garbage-strewn alley. This is our new home. This is our new home. It's so big. She bounced slightly on the cushions, testing their softness. And it smells nice, like lemons. Lorraine emerged from the kitchen where she had been organizing the supplies the moving company had delivered. Welcome home, sweetheart. What do you think? I love it, Grandma. Can I have the room with the purple walls? That one's already yours. Want to see? Ellie nodded eagerly, and Lorraine led her down the hallway to explore. Mason stood in the living room alone for the first time in over a week and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle onto his shoulders. He had done it. He had saved his daughter. He had given her a future she never would have had otherwise. And the price, the arrangement with Caroline, the child growing in her womb, the secrets he would carry for the rest of his life, suddenly seemed very far away. But it wasn't far away. It was just beginning. His phone rang. Caroline's number. She's home. Just arrived. She loves the apartment. Good, I'm glad. A pause. Mason, we need to talk. Something has happened. The tone in her voice made his stomach clench. What kind of something? Not over the phone. Can you come to the mansion tonight? After Ellie is settled. Of course. Is everything okay? Is the baby? The baby is fine. This is about Henderson and the board. Another pause longer this time. He's making his move, Mason, earlier than I expected. Mason closed his eyes. The brief moment of peace of normalcy was already ending. Reality was reasserting itself with brutal efficiency. I'll be there by 8. Thank you. And Mason, be careful. Henderson has people watching. Don't let anyone follow you. The call ended and Mason stood in his beautiful new apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Caroline's generosity, and wondered how much longer any of it would last. The drive to Westlake Hills took 40 minutes through evening traffic. Mason borrowed his mother's car, a practical sedan that wouldn't attract attention, and took a circuitous route, watching his mirrors for any sign of surveillance. He felt ridiculous, like a character in a spy movie, but Caroline's warning had been serious. Henderson Pierce was not someone to underestimate. The mansion looked different in the failing light, shadows pulled in corners that had seemed bright and welcoming during the day. The windows glowed with warm light, but there was something fortress-like about the high walls and iron gates. This was a place built for defense as much as comfort, a sanctuary against a hostile world. Margaret met him at the door and led him to Caroline's study without a word. The housekeeper's face was drawn, her movements more hurried than usual. Something had changed in the household, something that had everyone on edge. Caroline was standing by the window when he entered, her silhouette stark against the darkening sky. She had changed since he last saw her. Not physically, it was too early in the pregnancy for that, but something in her posture. The rigid control that usually defined her seemed to have cracked. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Her hands, usually so steady, fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. Thank you for coming. Mason crossed the room to stand beside her. Oh, what happened? She turned to face him, and he saw exhaustion in her eyes. Deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Henderson called an emergency board meeting for next week. He's claiming concerns about my leadership, my absences, my declining engagement with company affairs. She laughed bitterly. He's spinning a narrative that I'm losing control, that the company needs stable leadership during uncertain times, that the shareholders deserve someone who can give them their full attention. Can he actually do anything? You own 52%. I own 52% of the shares. But the board has broad authority over day-to-day operations. They can't remove me outright, but they can make my life very difficult. They can challenge my decisions, slow down initiatives, create enough chaos to spook the shareholders and tank the stock price. And if the stock price tanks, Caroline's jaw tightened. Some of my shares are held as collateral against company loans. If the price drops far enough, those loans get called in. I would have to sell shares to cover them. And if I sell enough shares, you lose majority control. Exactly. Henderson has been planning this for 15 years. He knows exactly which pressure points to hit. She moved to her desk and picked up a folder thick with documents. But that's not the worst of it. Mason took the folder and opened it. Inside were photographs, surveillance photographs, of him entering the mansion, of him walking through the gardens with Caroline, of a black Mercedes picking him up from his old apartment building. He knows about me. He knows someone is here. He doesn't know who yet or why, but he's digging. He has investigators following every lead, turning over every stone. Caroline's voice was hard controlled, but Mason could hear the fear beneath it. If he finds out about the pregnancy, about our arrangement, he'll use it to destroy me. He'll paint me as unstable, desperate, willing to buy a child from a janitor, rather than running my company properly. Would people believe that? People believe what they want to believe, and Henderson is very good at shaping narratives. She sat down heavily in her chair. I've spent my entire adult life building this company, protecting it, sacrificing everything for it. And now, because I dared to want something more, it might all come crashing down. Mason set the folder aside and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Then we fight back. We find something on Henderson. We get ahead of his story. We don't just wait for him to destroy us. You think I haven't tried? Henderson has been careful. 40 years in this business, and he's never made a mistake that anyone could prove. He's untouchable. No one is untouchable. Everyone has something to hide. We just have to find it. Caroline looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face. Why are you doing this? Your daughter is safe. Your debts are paid. You have everything you came for. You could walk away right now, take your $1 million when the baby is born and never look back. Why stay and fight a battle that isn't yours? Mason considered the question. A month ago, he would have had a simple answer. He was there for Ellie. Everything he did, every choice he made was for her benefit. But things had changed since then. He had changed. Because you stood by my daughter when you didn't have to. You sat at home sending messages every hour, worrying about a little girl you'd never met, praying for her recovery. You paid for her surgery, set up her trust fund, gave us a new home, and you never once made me feel like I owed you anything. He squeezed her hands. You're not just a contract to me anymore, Caroline. You're someone I care about, and I don't abandon people I care about. She stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, but you've got me anyway. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, two people holding on to each other in the gathering darkness. Then Caroline straightened and some of the steel returned to her spine. If we're going to fight Henderson, we need a plan. We need to know what he's hiding, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Then let's get started. The following days were a blur of strategy sessions and secret meetings. Carolyn reached out to allies within the company, board members who owed her favors or harbored their own resentments against Henderson. Mason combed through public records, financial disclosures, anything that might reveal a crack in Henderson's armor. The work was painstaking and often frustrating. Henderson had covered his tracks well. His financial records were immaculate. His public reputation was spotless. Whatever skeletons he had were buried deep. But everyone makes mistakes. Everyone leaves traces. And on the fourth day of searching, Mason found something. It was buried in a decade-old SEC filing, a footnote about a subsidiary company that had been quietly dissolved shortly after a major acquisition. The subsidiary had no clear purpose and no significant assets. It existed for 3 months, handled a single large transaction, and then vanished. Mason dug deeper. The transaction was a payment to a consulting firm based in the Cayman Islands. The amount was substantial, and the timing coincided perfectly with Henderson's successful bid to acquire a competitor that should have gone to another buyer. He bribed someone. Mason spread the documents across Caroline's desk. This consulting firm was a shell. The money went somewhere else, and whatever it bought him, it was enough to swing a major acquisition in his favor. Caroline studied the papers, her expression sharpening as she processed the implications. If this is what I think it is, Henderson committed securities fraud. He manipulated the acquisition process. He cheated shareholders out of fair value. Can we prove it? Not with this. This is circumstantial at best. We need the actual records from the consulting firm. We need to trace where the money went. And how do we get those? Caroline leaned back in her chair, a thin smile crossing her face. I know someone, a former federal prosecutor who now handles private investigations for clients who can afford his rates. If anyone can follow this trail, it's him. She picked up the phone and dialed. The conversation that followed was brief and cryptic, conducted in the shorthand of people who had done business before. When she hung up, the smile had grown. He'll have answers within the week. If Henderson did what we think he did, we'll have evidence that could send him to prison. In the board meeting, we delay, we stall, we buy time until the investigation is complete. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Henderson thinks he has me cornered. He thinks I'm weak, distracted, vulnerable. He has no idea what's coming. Mason joined her at the window, and if the investigation doesn't find anything, then we're back where we started, fighting a war we can't win. She turned to face him, her expression serious. But I've been fighting impossible battles my whole life, Mason. I've faced down men twice Henderson's age and 3 times his arrogance. I didn't get here by giving up when things got hard. She placed a hand on her stomach where the first subtle curve of pregnancy was beginning to show. I have too much to lose now. This child, this company, this chance at something I never thought I would have. Her eyes met his. I will not let Henderson Pierce take any of it from me. The week that followed was the longest of Mason's life. He divided his time between Ellie's recovery and Caroline's crisis, shuttling between his new apartment and the mansion, trying to be present for both of the people who needed him. Ellie continued to improve. Her energy returned in bursts longer each day as her body adjusted to its newly repaired heart. She started asking questions about the apartment, about the mysterious benefactor who had paid for everything, about why their lives had suddenly changed so dramatically. Mason answered as honestly as he could without revealing the full truth. A kind person helped us. Someone who wanted to make sure you got better. No, you can't meet them yet. Someday, maybe when you're older. Ellie accepted his explanations with the trusting innocence of childhood. She was too busy exploring her new room and making friends with the neighborhood cats to worry about adult complications. And Mason was grateful for that. She deserved a few years of normalcy before the weight of the world settled on her shoulders. Caroline's investigator worked quickly. Preliminary results came in on the 5th day. The shell company in the Caymans had received funds from Henderson's subsidiary and immediately transferred them to an account in Switzerland. That account was controlled by a trust whose beneficiary was the wife of the investment banker who handled the competing bid. Caroline set down the report, her hands trembling with suppressed excitement. Henderson paid off the opposition. He bought his way to victory and covered his tracks with offshore accounts in shell companies. Is this enough? It's more than enough. This is securities fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. If we take this to the SEC, Henderson is finished. She looked up at Mason, her eyes bright with fierce satisfaction. We have him. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday. Caroline spent the weekend preparing her presentation, rehearsing her delivery, anticipating every possible response Henderson might offer. Mason watched her work, marveling at the transformation. The exhausted, vulnerable woman who had cried in his arms just days ago had been replaced by something fierce and unstoppable. This was the Caroline Aldrich the business world feared, and Henderson Pierce had no idea what was about to hit him. Sunday night, Mason sat with Caroline in her study as she reviewed her notes one final time. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, rain pattered against the windows. It felt like the calm before a storm. Are you ready? Caroline looked up from her papers. I've been ready for this moment for 15 years. Henderson has undermined me, second-guessed me, and waited for me to fail since the day I took over this company. Tomorrow, I finally get to show him what happens to people who bet against me. And the pregnancy, the arrangement, what if he tries to use that against you? Let him try. By the time I'm done presenting this evidence, no one will care about anything except Henderson's crimes. She set down her notes and walked to where Mason sat. Besides, I've decided something I've been thinking about for weeks now. What's that? She sat beside him, taking his hands in hers. When this is over, when Henderson is dealt with, and the company is secure, I'm going to tell the world about the baby. Not the arrangement that stays between us forever, but the pregnancy itself. I'm going to announce that I'm expecting a child. Mason blinked. Won't that raise questions? It will raise many questions, and I'll answer exactly as many as I choose to answer. The father is a private matter. The details are my own business. What matters is that I'm not ashamed of this child, Mason. I'm not going to hide them like some dirty secret. She placed a hand on her stomach. This baby is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and whatever comes next, I want them to know they were wanted, they were planned for, they were loved from the very beginning. Mason felt something crack open inside his chest. Love. It was a word neither of them had spoken aloud, a word that seemed too fragile for the complicated reality of their situation. But hearing Caroline talk about the baby, seeing the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, he understood something he had been avoiding for weeks. He was falling in love with her, not the transaction, not the arrangement, her, the woman behind the billions and the boardrooms, the woman who ate instant noodles at midnight because she never learned to cook. The woman who kept her mother's teddy bear in her bedside drawer. The woman who was terrified of becoming a parent but refused to let that fear stop her. He was falling in love with Caroline Aldrich, and he had no idea what to do about it. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said quietly, I want you to know something. This arrangement, this deal, we made, it started as business, but it became something else, something I don't have a name for yet. Caroline met his eyes, and for a moment the mask dropped completely. I know. I feel it too. What do we do about it? I don't know. She laughed softly, a sound he had rarely heard from her. I've spent my whole life knowing exactly what to do, having a plan for every contingency. And now with you, I have no plan at all. I'm just living, feeling, taking each day as it comes. Is that so bad? It's terrifying. She leaned her head against his shoulder. But it's also the most alive I've felt in years. They sat together in the firelight, two people on the edge of something new, something fragile, something neither of them fully understood. Tomorrow would bring battles and confrontations and the uncertain future of an empire. But tonight, in this moment, there was only the warmth of the fire and the sound of rain and the quiet miracle of two hearts learning to beat together. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Tonight was for them.